Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, I'm still recovering from COVID, still sleeping a lot, so it might look a little disheveled. I apologize for that, but I'm going to keep on making the content. Just a little over a week away from 2 weeks where I will be away from home. First to head to Gettysburg for the Gettysburg Film Festival, and there are still a few tickets available for my event with JD from the History Underground at the Adams County Historical Society on that Sunday afternoon. I'm going to put a link in the description for the Gettysburg Film Festival because it was also just announced today that there's an event going on at Gettysburg High School the Friday night of the film festival, which there are still some tickets available for, involving Martin Sheen, Sam Waterston, and Ken Burns. I've known about this for a few weeks. They just finally announced Martin Sheen this morning, so I can finally talk about it on the channel. But you can follow the link in the description to check out all of that stuff if you want to see any of the events connected with the Gettysburg Film Festival. Also, that weekend on that Saturday afternoon, from 2:30 to 4:30, I think, is the time we decided on. You can meet me and JD from the History Underground, and also our friend Matt Leach, who played Floyd Talbert in Band of Brothers, who's going to be with us. We're going to be at the new location of the Gettysburg Museum of History. They're moving into a bigger building, which he has needed greatly for a while now. It's right down the street from the old building. It's on Baltimore Street. So I'll make another announcement about that when we get closer and give you the exact address and specific times to make sure I get it all right. But that's all coming that weekend. So if you have any intention of being anywhere near Gettysburg that weekend, please come and join us. Eli and I are going to be there all weekend. JD's going to be there all weekend. It's going to be amazing. But as soon as I get back from Gettysburg, the next day, I'm leaving for our group trip to Rome. So with that in mind, I've been doing a little bit of digging into Roman history. And for me personally, my favorite time of Roman history to study is that early empire history, the first 2 centuries AD. So specifically, what we call the Julio Claudio dynasty, which is basically the first 5 emperors, the ones that are all related to each other somehow in some kind of weird, convoluted way. So we're talking about Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and then finally Nero. Nero being the great-great-grandson of Augustus, and also the great-grandson of Mark Antony, and the nephew of Caligula. So otherwise, they're all like marriages and adoptions and all kinds of weird things happening. All of that is a long way to say we're going to talk about Nero today, one of the most infamous Roman emperors for a number of reasons, and I've just been studying some about him the last few days, so I thought it'd be a good time to check it out. I'll put the link in the description so that you can check it out without my commentary. This is from Biographics and our friend Simon Whistler. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
So imagine for a moment that you can travel backwards through time and give your 16-year-old self the powers of a god. Imagine placing the lives and fates of millions into your trembling teenage hands. Would the result be a happier world, a utopia, or would it be a catastrophe for everyone involved, including your younger self? In October 54 AD, the Roman Empire made this little thought experiment a terrifying reality. They elevated an emotionally unstable 16-year-old boy to the position of emperor. That boy's name? Well, it was Nero. The last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, Nero transformed the greatest empire the world has ever seen into a playground for his darkest desires.
It's ironic to me that the two that are actually blood related to Augustus, we always, at least I think most people, when they remember Roman emperors, they remember him as this super intelligent, not very physically intimidating, but super intelligent, kind of cunning, very calculated guy. And then you see, at least to me, the total opposite of that when I think of Roman emperors who are kind of just living off of their emotions, and they're emotionally unstable and making just what we would think of as psychotic decisions. You think of Caligula and Nero, and those are the two who are actually related in a blood way to Augustus, or at least in a direct way. with Caligula being a great-grandson of Augustus and Nero being a great-great-grandson. I don't know, I just found that interesting.
He had his own mother murdered, ordered Christians burned alive for entertainment, and indulged in perversions so shocking that make the Marquis de Sade blush. Yet he died beloved by Rome's commoners and convinced that he was the greatest artist who had ever lived. Join us today as we investigate the life of the most infamous Roman of all.
So just as we start into this, I mean, there are a lot of things that I think people tend to believe are true about Nero. I think the most common are he's the one who fiddled while Rome burned. He fed Christians to the lions. Those two things, there's not actually a lot of evidence they actually happened. Did he begin the very heavy Roman persecution of Christians? Absolutely. Did he fiddle while Rome burned? Probably not. I think a lot of why people pin that stuff on him, the lions thing, it might have happened because I think in the aftermath of the fire in Rome, the way he benefited himself at the expense of a lot of other influential people in Rome is what comes back to bite him. So hopefully they're going to clear up some of those misconceptions, because we don't need misconceptions when it comes to Nero. There's enough actual things that he did that are pretty awful.
If you were to take a quick glance at the backgrounds of Nero, you might assume the emperor had a childhood of unparalleled luxury. Born Lucius Domitius Aenobarbus on December 15, 37 AD, Nero was a member of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, aka the dudes who had been ruling Rome for decades. His mother, Julia Agrippina, commonly known as...
So for decades, I mean, if we go all the way back to Julius Caesar, who wasn't an emperor, he was made a dictator, but he wasn't an emperor. The empire hadn't started yet, he being kind of the beginning of this dynasty. We're talking 80 years before Nero's birth. And Nero's born right around the time that the second emperor of Rome, Tiberius, dies. So he's born right at the beginning of his uncle Caligula's reign.
Agrippina the Younger was a direct descendant of the first emperor Augustus, and his great-uncle was Claudius. But while that might sound like a ticket to life on Roman Easy Street, Nero's mother Agrippina could have told him differently. The Julio-Claudians enjoyed nothing more than fratricide. The rot had started way back when Agrippina herself was just a girl growing up with her brother Caligula. As you'll know if you've already watched our Caligula video, Agrippina's dad was a popular general who was in line for the imperial throne, so naturally Agrippina's adopted grandfather, the Emperor Tiberius, had him poisoned in 19 AD. It was just...
So there's a lot of adoption, a lot of legal wranglings that go on. So a lot of these early dynasties involve a lot of that, where it's not necessarily, even though there are some blood relations here, a lot of these guys come to power because of their legal adoption by other people and because of marriages that happen. Caligula is not even his name. It's really kind of a nickname. I think it means little boots.
Just the first in a long line of Julio-Claudian family murders. So let's jump ahead to 37 AD. Tiberius is dead and Agrippina's brother Caligula inherits the throne. At first, things were fine. It was during this period of calm that Agrippina gave birth to Nero. But then Caligula had one of his trademark cuckoo moments and decided Agrippina was plotting to kill him. So he took all of her property and banished her to a tiny island where she could have no contact with her son. Dumped with a random aunt, young Nero was forced to make do with a dancer as a tutor. If that sounds actually kinda alright, well, just know that dancers, actors, and poets were considered the lowest of the low in Roman society, basically no better than prostitutes.
So this is important, and I say this all the time. In order to understand the adults that some of these historical figures become, looking at their childhood can give us some real insight. And if there's already some possibly genetic mental health stuff that I think clearly had to be a part of this family, the upbringing in these situations. And imagine being born into a world where anyone around you at any given moment could be killed because of who they are and because of their proximity to people in power or because of what family they're a part of. It's a heck of a way to grow up. And for the most stable of people, that could really mess with your psyche. And so I have no doubt whatsoever that some of what happens to Nero in his younger years is going to affect the man that he becomes.
Seems likely Nero's aunt felt there was no point wasting good money on a boy who might not live long anyway. Knowing Caligula's paranoia, it'd be a miracle if Nero reached his 5th birthday. But thank Jupiter, that miracle happened. On the 24th of January 41 AD, the elite Praetorian Guard assassinated Caligula, stabbing him to death outside the Palatine Games. They then marched straight to Claudius and declared him the new emperor. So there was this blink and you'll miss it moment at the start of this video where we mentioned that Claudius was Nero's great uncle. Well, that meant Agrippina was Claudius's niece. And unlike Tiberius or Caligula, Emperor Claudius was all about not killing his relatives. No sooner had Claudius taken the throne than he recalled Agrippina from her exile. At last, reunited with...
And that's how quickly things can change. And this isn't unique to the Roman Empire. This kind of thing happened, for example, a perfect example is in England when you have the Tudor dynasty where Henry VIII dies right as people were lined up to be executed. There were people who were days away from being executed, but when Henry VIII died, it changed that. And then his son becomes king at like 9 years old. And then when he dies and his sister Mary, who we remember as Bloody Mary, comes to the throne, suddenly people who were on the in are suddenly on the outs because they're Protestant. And vice versa, people who were Catholic and had to hide and couldn't practice their faith in public suddenly are the ones in charge and running the show again, and they turn on the people who had previously been the ones in charge. That's how quickly things can change, and that's the world that these people live in.
With her son Nero, Agrippina swore she would never again be left at the mercy of her cruel and capricious relatives. That meant getting her wealth back. That meant building her own power base. But how was a penniless widow meant to do that in a patriarchal society like Rome? Well, you just leave that to Agrippina. First, Agrippina pressured her uncle to find her a husband, so Claudius forced a consul to marry her. Next, Agrippina poisoned that consul and inherited his wealth. Then came 48 AD and Claudius's execution of his wife. Barely was her body cold than Agrippina was seducing the emperor's advisor and giving him an excellent plan. Why didn't Claudius just marry Agrippina? The proposal was dressed up as a way of uniting the two Julio-Claudian branches and ending fratricides once and for all. But really, it was just an excuse for Agrippina to get closer to power while Claudius got to live out his creepy incest fantasies. On January the 1st, 49...
And if there's one thing that unfortunately describes this whole dynasty, it's creepy fantasies, as we're going to see later with Nero. There's some messed up stuff that he does at the end of his life, and he's not the only one who does it.
In AD, Agrippina became empress. 1 year later, Claudius adopted her son Nero. In 10 short years, Agrippina had taken herself and Nero from pariahs to the heart of imperial Rome. They had money and they had power.
And if you're Nero, if you're this kid who went from being exiled and treated as nothing and wondering if every day was your last, to now being in line to be the emperor and being thrust into this position where you're going to have all this power, man, what does that do to you? How does that impact your thought process and the way that you see the world around you?
Never forget that Agrippina was from a family that prided itself on killing its useless members. And, well, what use did Empress Agrippina have now for her uncle Claudius? Come 51 AD, all was not well in Rome's imperial palace. That same year, Agrippina had pressured Claudius into naming Nero his co-heir alongside the emperor's natural son Britannicus. With Nero suddenly in line for half the throne, Claudius's advisors were taking a bit of a closer look at him. And when they took that...
And if you're Claudius, how do you not see what's happening here? I mean, obviously he must be blinded by love, blinded by something. Because this is someone who has already shown they're capable of offing a husband to get what they want. And the minute you name her son your legal heir, you're useless to her.
Closer look, they did not like what they saw. By now a teenager, Nero was a sulky, spoiled brat who would rather spend his time learning to play the lyre than learning how to rule. Worse still, the boy was developing a bit of a cruel streak. One by one, people started to wonder if they might just have another Caligula on their hands. Yet they were really powerless to stop Agrippina from building her son's power base. In 53 AD, Agrippina forced Nero into a marriage with Claudia Octavia, the daughter of Claudius. When we say forced here, we really do mean it. Claudia Octavia was being pursued by another suitor at the time. Agrippina wrecked that courtship and drove the suitor to suicide. Yet even this marriage of convenience, it wasn't enough to convince Agrippina that she was safe and that another Caligula wouldn't just come along and drive her into poverty again. The only way to do that was to make herself answerable to no one. On the 13th of October 54 AD, Emperor Claudius, he suddenly died. Ancient sources speculate that Agrippina bribed the emperor's taster and slipped him poisoned mushrooms. Whether that's true or not, the results were absolutely the same. Control of the empire went to Claudius's heirs, Nero and Britannicus.
There's a lot of these kinds of stories over the last several thousand years that come out about the fate of leaders. You know, in British medieval history, there's the stories of what was done to Edward II, about the possibility that he had some, like a red-hot poker shoved through his anus to kill him. Probably not true, but came about years later. So there's all this kind of speculation, and it's hard to sift through sometimes the sources to know what's true and what's not. Is it plausible that she had him poisoned? Absolutely. Do we know for sure that's what happened? I don't know that we ever will.
Or rather, that's what should have happened. At the moment Claudius died, only Nero was old enough to be considered an adult. Britannicus was still a child and legally incapable of ruling. So when Agrippina presented Nero alone to the Praetorian Guard and asked them to salute their new emperor, there was nothing Britannicus could do. Aged only 60, Nero was elevated to be the sole ruler of the world's most powerful empire. And let's just pause here for a second to imagine just how Agrippina must have felt that day. Against all the odds, she had overcome a childhood of tragedy and an adulthood of exile to install herself at the very heart of Rome.
But she had also demonstrated to a very emotionally unstable son how you take and hold power. And she has set the standard for him that she may find herself on the other end of if she finds herself trying to manipulate him.
She'd murdered her second husband, she'd manipulated and killed an emperor, and now her son was on the throne. We hope Agrippina savored that moment. We really do, because it just wasn't destined to last very long. Just as his mother had started to wonder if she really needed Claudius, the new emperor Nero started to wonder if he really needed Agrippina.
Exactly.
Before long, Agrippina found herself being slowly pushed out of the corridors of power. Determined to fight, the wily murderess tried to ally herself with Britannicus, only for Nero to have his stepbrother poisoned. Not long
So now you align yourself with him, and what have you done? You've made him a threat. So, I mean, this is the ultimate example of blank around and find out, right? She put herself in this position, and she's basically played the game so well that she taught her son how to play it even better.
After, Agrippina was moved out of the palace to a little villa on the outskirts of Rome. Even the previous marriage she had secured for Nero with Claudia Octavia, it was destroyed as Nero took up instead with Poppaea Sabina. As a last-ditch effort, Agrippina...
The mention of that woman's name, to me, it's eliciting something that you'll see as we get into this later.
Agrippina made overtures to Nero's cousin, suggesting that they could depose the teenage emperor together. But Agrippina's luck, well, it had run out. In 59 AD, Nero had Agrippina board a boat that was designed to sink and drown her. When she managed to survive the grueling swim to the shore, her son simply ordered her stabbed to death. It is said that as she realized what was about to happen, Agrippina pointed at her womb and screamed, "Stab me there where the monster had been nurtured."
You helped nurture that monster. You helped create him.
Agrippina died on March 23, 59 AD. After the news leaked out, Nero, in a bit of a half-assed effort, tried to tell everyone that it had been a suicide. But no one in Rome was under any illusions. They knew what had gone down. The young emperor, he had broken the greatest taboo, killing his own mother. Claudius's advisors had been wrong. Nero wasn't the next Caligula. He was something much, much worse.
Yep.
Now, you probably have a bit of a mental checklist prepared for the rest of this video. Fiddling as Rome burns, check. Persecuting the Christians, also check. Well, don't worry, we're going to get to those dubious highlights, but before we tell you about Nero, the crazy emperor, we've got to tell you about Nero, the insanely popular emperor.
That's right. Let's not kid ourselves. If you look at the history of emperors, I mean, in the aftermath of Nero, you're going to have 4 emperors in 1 year. They call it the year of 4 emperors at AD 69. He had to be doing something right to have lasted as long as he did. Now, granted, he's also the last of a line of people in this dynasty that's actually related to Augustus, who's seen as a god at this point. But don't allow yourself to think that he wasn't doing something right to stay in power as long as he did.
Right, he was really, really popular. For all his name may now be synonymous with decadence, Nero started his reign actually being quite a cool dude. Prior to Agrippina's death, Nero had banned secret trials, cracked down on corruption, and handed powers back to the Senate. He also slashed taxes, banned capital punishment, granted more rights to slaves, banned animal blood sports, and tried to phase out gladiatorial combat and replace it with Greek wrestling. So popular were these measures that the great emperor Trajan would later declare Nero's first 5 years as the greatest reign in Roman history.
And that's pretty fascinating because Trajan, whose story I'm just now getting into a little bit, is really kind of a breath of fresh air in the aftermath of all of this ugliness that happens for a few decades in this part of Roman history.
And it's here that we finally reach one of the contradictions surrounding Nero. Despite all the mad stuff he did, he was beloved by his subjects. Nero had a common touch that other Roman elites lacked. After his death, a whole generation of ambitious provincials would claim to be Nero's heirs as a shortcut to popularity. So why then do we only hear about the bad stuff? Maybe it's because the common folk didn't write the histories. Neither did the ambitious provincials, but rather the moneyed Roman elite did. And those guys, they couldn't stand the way that Nero debased his office.
And we talk about this all the time. When people write history, what is their bias? What is their viewpoint? What are they trying to communicate? It all matters.
The issue was this: unlike Augustus, Tiberius, or Caligula, Nero had never wanted to be emperor. It was Agrippina who had schemed him into the palace and into power. The other reluctant emperor, Claudius, had at least been old enough to understand the responsibilities of office. Nero, though, he was young enough to understand that the responsibilities of office could kiss his Roman arse. Not long after Agrippina's death, Nero talked openly about giving up the throne to become a full-time poet. But the power that came with being a living god was simply too much fun, so instead Nero began to live an artist's life parallel to his imperial one. The young emperor spent his spare time partying in brothels, carousing with actors, hanging out with lowlifes. He liked to get drunk and appear on stage in theaters, sometimes in female roles. Remember, the Romans thought that artists were lower than sex workers. Seeing Nero indulge his artistic side for them was sort of like seeing the Queen of England dance naked for cash in an Amsterdam brothel. And you're welcome for that mental image.
Oh my gosh.
What happens next? A better monarchical comparison might be Henry VIII. In 62 AD, Nero's mistress, Poppaea Sabina, became pregnant. Since Nero was still married to the popular Claudia Octavia, this caused a bit of a scandal.
Well,
so
what
Nero
to do?
Divorced Claudia and banished her into exile, an underhand move that was about to get even more underhanded. When the people of Rome protested her banishment, Nero had his ex-wife murdered. It was the second time he'd killed a close relative, and just as with Agrippina, Nero vaguely made out that it had been a suicide. In reality, it was yet another bloodstain on the artist emperor's hands, and it would certainly not be the last. By July the 18th, 64 AD, Emperor Nero's initial popularity, it was in terminal nosedive. The same year Nero had Claudia murdered, the Praetorian Guard prefect Boris had died. A natural moderate, it kept the emperor's darkest desires in check. So
that's a really important fact to understand in all of this, and granted, I am no expert on Roman history, and so others who know more than I do can comment on this, and I invite you to please do that on anything we're talking about on this episode. The Praetorian Guard is so close and so vital to the emperor. It's like the Secret Service, but way more important and way more influential and powerful. Look at the times in history where the Praetorian Guard, Caligula, for example, Praetorian Guard actually determines who will be emperor. And they have that kind of power because they have the power of life and death over the emperor. And that means that the leader of that guard has a ton of authority and a ton of influence. And Nero stays alive, I think, as long as he does, because he manages that pretty well with the Praetorian Guard and makes sure that they're paid well and that the influence is proper and those kinds of things.
What did Nero do? He replaced him with a guy called Tigellinus, who thought the best thing the emperor could do with his dark desires was absolutely let them loose. That meant orgies, bloody purges of the elite, and even fewer hecks given about representing the office of emperor. Come that hot July of 64 AD, the people of Rome were fed up with the emperor and ready to believe just about anything about him. And into this tinderbox of resentment came a very real spark. The causes of the Great Fire of Rome are lost to history. All we know is that on July the 18th, a conflagration swept through the Eternal City. At the time, Rome was a collection of wooden shacks that had been thrown up without any central plan. So when the inferno got going, it really got going. The fire burned for a week. By the time it fizzled, 3 of the city's districts had been destroyed and the imperial palace itself had been damaged. And what was Emperor Nero doing while all of this destruction took place?
He wasn't even in town.
Well, no, what you're thinking is absolutely wrong.
Nope.
I mean, the one thing that everyone knows about Nero is that he fiddled as Rome burns, but it turns out that that is actually total bunk. Nero wasn't even in the city at this time. Far from regarding the fire as a source of amusement, Tacitus tells us that Nero raced back to Rome and spearheaded the relief efforts. He even let hundreds of those left homeless by the disaster stay in his imperial palace.
The mistake that he makes, and I think that the reason that these kinds of stories about him fiddling while Rome burns get retroactively put on him is, number one, because of the blame that gets put on the Christians and the persecution that begins. This is when you're going to have people like Paul and Peter are going to be executed during the aftermath of this fire under Nero. So that's part of it, but also because of how he takes advantage of the fire in terms of the real estate that's suddenly available.
This kind of raises the question, well, why do we think that Nero fiddled while Rome burns? Well, there's 2 reasons. One involves a building and the other involves a Jewish cult. So let's tackle the building one first.
Literally everything I just said, I think is what he's going to say.
Once the fire was over, Nero pledged to rebuild Rome grander than before. In most respects, he succeeded, constructing a new city with streets wide enough to hinder future fires. However, he also decided to build a massive palace atop the rubble, a palace that included a 120-foot-tall statue of himself. For a Roman public that was already leaning a bit anti-Nero, this was just too much. Rumors started to swell that Nero had set the fire himself specifically so that he could build this stupid palace.
And that's exactly the point, is that when you take advantage of something that you didn't cause, it makes it a lot easier for people to believe you did cause it.
Panicked, Nero decided that he needed to find someone to blame rather fast. His chosen scapegoats were, surprise, surprise, a Jewish sect known as the Christians. In 64 AD, Rome's Christians were a small cult comprising of non-citizens, refugees, and Greek-speaking outsiders. Like foreigners, refugees and immigrants sadly discover all too frequently, that made them perfect targets.
Yeah, so in a polytheistic society where you have this religion, Judaism, which they're already dealing with some major issues in Judea that are going to come to a head here in just the next couple of years. And now you have another monotheistic cult, as they would see it, coming out of this with Christianity. And they have missionaries that are actually going, people like Paul, who is going from city to city, and by this point is in Rome, and so is Peter, preaching about Jesus. They were kind of annoying to a lot of these people, and it was probably seen as pretty easy to blame them for this.
On Nero's orders, prominent Christians were tortured until they confessed to starting the fire. Nero then set about having them all rounded up and gruesomely executed. Unlike the tale of Nero fiddling, all the stories you've heard about his torture of the Christians are absolutely true. Christians really were torn apart by wild animals. Nero really did have them burned alive to illuminate his garden parties. Perhaps it's no wonder early Christians came to seriously hate Nero. There's a theory that the Antichrist in the book of Revelation was meant to symbolize this emperor.
Yeah, Revelation is written after this time. So the images that John, the author of Revelation, creates, and even the number 666 that represents Antichrist, some people say was a number that represented Nero. Nero was absolutely meant to be the image that people had in their minds when they read about Antichrist.
But it wasn't just the Christians who disliked Nero's persecution. The extreme tortures inflicted were disturbing by even Roman standards. In the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, people began to whisper to one another that things were getting out of hand. They were beginning to whisper that it was time to get rid of their arsonist emperor. But they hadn't counted on just how hard to kill Nero would turn out to be.
Oh no, we're going to talk about the wife. And then the next wife.
When people want to prove just what a monster Nero was, they usually point to his actions in 64 AD, allegedly letting Rome burn and actually slaughtering the Christians. Really though, they should point to the emperor's antics the following year. If 64 AD was Nero at his most misunderstood, 65 AD was Nero at his psychotic peak.
Yes.
It started out when a Senate plot against Nero was discovered. What followed was a purge that saw 23 conspirators forced to commit suicide, along with the philosopher Seneca. But if 23 dead doesn't sound so bad, know that this was just the warm-up act. In the wake of the conspiracy, Nero brought back the treason trials that had been a feature of Tiberius and Caligula's rules.
So what we see happening then is Nero is pretty popular until some things happen that he makes some miscalculations on, right? So the fire happens. He wasn't responsible for the fire, but he takes advantage of the fire. This isn't popular, and so in response to a very unpopular move on his part to take advantage of this fire to get himself ahead and build a bigger palace and those sorts of things, he responds by persecuting people who were largely probably seen by people as harmless, certainly not a threat to the empire, even if they were maybe annoying and people didn't like them very much or didn't understand what they believed. So now, in response to that, he goes after other people. And so Nero's problem is that he keeps escalating the situation, and in doing so, rather than fixing his unpopularity problem, he actually makes it worse.
Guru courts that convicted and executed people on a whim, the treason trials were infamous for being an underhanded way for the emperor to get rid of anyone that he didn't like. And Nero, in 65 AD, he had an enemies list longer than War and Peace. Yet even this bloodshed doesn't compare to Nero's cruelest act that year. At some point that summer, Nero got into a blazing row with his wife.
Yep.
You might remember her, that's Poppaea Sabina, the mistress who got pregnant, causing Nero to murder his previous wife.
And from all accounts that I've read and heard about, she was considered to be gorgeous and like one of the great beauties of Rome, and everyone was like in awe of this wife that he had.
Well, Poppaea probably should have realized that ordering your wife's assassination isn't a great sign for marital stability. According to Tacitus, Nero, mad with rage, kicked Poppaea to death. The poor girl was pregnant at this time, and Nero made sure to aim his vicious kicks at her swollen stomach. In the aftermath of this brutal double murder, Nero went insane. He had Poppaea stuffed and embalmed and her corpse deposited in a mausoleum so that he could visit it whenever he wanted.
There's another aspect to this, though, and I think it's important to mention here, is that this is the aftermath of the... this is a really unflattering face for Simon to be paused on. There we go, that's better. This is the immediate aftermath of the fire. And up until this point, what happens to these emperors and their wives and their family members, they're cremated, and their ashes are put into the mausoleum of Augustus. Maybe fire's not the best thing right now, so there may be an aspect of that having her embalmed and kind of mummified was preferable to burning in the aftermath of everything.
pyre stuffed and embalmed, and a corpse deposited in a mausoleum so that he could visit it whenever he wanted. Freakier still, Nero caught sight of a 13-year-old boy a few weeks later who was the spitting image of his murdered wife. Known as Sporus, this unlucky boy was kidnapped by Nero's men and castrated. Nero then forced Sporus to dress in clothes belonging to the dead Poppaea and married him in a bizarre service.
He literally had the guy like gender assignment surgery at a time when there was no anesthetic and there was no guarantee he'd even survive it. He was a teenager, and then he paraded him around as Pompeia, even though he called him Sporus. That wasn't his real name. And then the most horrible part of this is that even after Nero dies, other people try to do the same to him.
After that, Sporus could be seen dressed and acting like the dead empress sat at Nero's side as the deranged emperor kissed and fondled him. If this wasn't already creepy enough, Nero himself took to wearing a Poppaea mask when he performed on stage, embodying the girl whose life he had so viciously snatched away. Yet, even as he drifted into Norman Bates territory, Nero did not lose his common touch. The next year, 66 AD, he left on a tour of Rome's eastern provinces, effectively giving himself a year's break from running the empire. But rather than react to this creepy murderer the way the elites in Rome had, those in the East acted like Nero was an ancient rock star. The thing was, Nero, he knew how to play a crowd. In Greece, he dressed like an ascetic with bare feet and flowing hair and took an active interest in the country's new religions. Wherever he went, he granted towns free city status, ensuring the inhabitants celebrated him. He was so popular that he even took part in the Olympic Games. Unsurprisingly, he won every event that he entered.
There's a story about him, doing like a horse race in this time, where everybody else is using 2 or 4 horses and he uses like 8 or 10 horses, and everybody was in awe because it was such a it was a dangerous thing to have that many horses, but it also guaranteed that he was the fastest.
It seems Nero himself felt being in the East was a form of freedom. He began appearing on stage more and more, often playing the roles of pregnant women. When he got back to Rome, upper society, it was more scandalized than ever. But Nero was wrong if he thought that he could just keep violating norms and doing whatever the hell he felt like. The emperor, he didn't know it yet, but his days on this earth, well, they were already numbered. In early 68 AD, Nero sent an order to the governor of Gaul, a guy called Vindex, telling him to raise local taxes. It was just one of many such orders that Nero was in the habit of sending out to fund his lavish lifestyle. But this time, something was different. Nero didn't know it, but Vindex was at breaking point. Fed up with endlessly having to raise taxes on Gaul, Vindex snapped when he saw Nero's latest demand. He took up arms and declared himself in rebellion against the emperor.
Remember, most of these governors are from very influential families, and they got these roles because they're already powerful people. And so any one of them, if they turn on you, number one, they're far enough away that you can't immediately get your hands on them. And by the time you even know what's happening, it might already be too late. And if they cause other people to rise up, you very quickly have a major problem on your hands.
But then he did a funny thing. He declared allegiance to the popular governor of Spain, a guy named Galba. This was funny because Galba was very much not in rebellion. When he heard of Vindex's declaration...
Yeah, could you imagine? Galba's like this older guy, and he hears, oh, somebody just declared you emperor. Well, now you got pulled into something you didn't even want to be a part of in the first place.
Freaked out and declared himself for Nero. But just hearing Vindex mention Galba was enough to send Nero's paranoia into overdrive, and he had both men declared enemies of Rome. Realizing he was doomed either way, Galba went, screw it, and declared himself in rebellion after all.
Again, this is a perfect example that Nero's, one of his biggest flaws, for all his many flaws, is his complete inability to respond appropriately to a situation. He created so much of this because of how he responded to problems. He just didn't know how to deal with it appropriately.
Unfortunately for Nero, a popular governor leading a rebellion was exactly the news that Rome had been waiting for. As news of Galba's revolt hit, the Praetorian Guard came out in support of him, as did the Senate, as did a huge swath of the army, as did, well, everybody. On the night of June the 9th, 68 AD, Nero woke up to find his palace empty. He sensed the end was near. Everyone had deserted the emperor. As Nero ran through the empty, cavernous rooms, he screamed first for help, and then for someone to kill him. When no voice voices came in reply. Nero is said to have wailed, "Have I neither friend nor foe?" But the emperor, he was wrong. He had plenty of foes. Across the city, the Senate had called an emergency meeting. Seeing which way the wind was blowing, they declared Nero an enemy of Rome and dispatched soldiers to finish him off. But Nero was no longer in his palace. Accompanied by a handful of slaves and one freedman, Nero had fled to a darkened villa 4 miles outside of the Eternal City. He had been able to make it to the east of the empire, where it was still popular, where he might have stood a chance. But that chance, it slipped through his fingers, and now there was only one way that this could end. As the soldiers closed in on his hiding place, Nero is said to have started muttering to himself, "What an artist dies in me." He demanded his slaves kill him, but to no avail. Finally, with the soldiers right outside and dawn finally breaking, Nero snatched a dagger from someone and plunged it deep into his own throat. The soldiers stormed in to find the emperor knelt on the floor, his tunic soaked with blood. With what we imagine must have been an unhinged grin on his face, Nero supposedly delivered one last immortal line to the men sent to kill him. Too late. Emperor Nero died that morning, unloved and alone, a pariah to his people. With his death, the Julio-Claudian line that had ruled Rome since it became an empire, it was snuffed out. The fratricidal family that had given the world the highs of Augustus and the lows of Caligula would produce no more emperors.
Yeah, this is nearly 100 years of empire under this Julio-Claudian line. And now you're going to have 4 emperors in succession, and then you're going to get a little bit of stability after that.
But if anyone was expecting Nero's death to herald an era of stability, well, they were in for a rather rude awakening. In the wake of Nero's suicide, Galba was made emperor, but he ruled a mere 6 months before he was assassinated. Galba's death would plunge the empire into chaos. 69 AD would see 4 emperors come and go before the dust settled and Vespasian claimed the throne. But all of that's for another video. What of Nero? What of the man we came here to discuss? Although he's infamous today as the most decadent emperor, you could argue that Nero wasn't the worst. Sure, he did some terrible and inhuman things, but even his cruelest acts weren't the outright sadism of Caligula as much as they were the lashings out of an angry teenage boy who never mentally grew up. It's true that Nero was a nasty man and an unhinged pervert, but it's also true that his badness is sometimes exaggerated. He never fiddled while Rome burned. The first 10 years of his rule, they were even something of a golden age.
And the same was true for Caligula. Caligula didn't immediately start out psychotic. Something snapped in him at some point.
That we remember the awful, vicious side of Nero. It's also worth remembering that history is more nuanced than it often appears.
Yeah.
Nero was deranged, but hopefully in our video today we've shown there was more to him than simply being Rome's crazy emperor. So I really hope you found that video.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Roman history is something I'm getting more and more into, especially because I'm going there in a couple of weeks, and I will be filming a lot of content for the channel from Rome, from Florence, from Pompeii, and the Monte Cassino battlefield. Really excited to be bringing all of that to you. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll put up some links to some other videos, to some content related to the Roman Empire and to Roman history. And also, don't forget to check out the Gettysburg Film Festival if you want to come and join us in Gettysburg that weekend. Even if you don't have tickets for anything, still come and meet us on Saturday, or just look for us on the battlefield. We'll be hanging out. Thanks for watching.